I want to start with a poem by one of my favorite poets, the late Tupac Shakur. And this was probably done at the time when he was at the School of the Arts in Maryland, where he met Jada Pinkett, now Jada Pinkett Smith. It's a poem that says, "Did you hear about the rose that grew from a crack in the concrete? Proving nature's law is wrong, it learned to walk without having feet. Funny it seems, but by keeping its dreams, it learned to breathe fresh air. Long live the rose that grew from concrete when no one else ever cared." The poem says a lot. It says, one, that every child in America does not grow from the same fertile ground. Some children grow in very fertile ground with every opportunity, and we expect roses to grow from fertile ground, so roses grow. But there are those kids that are the exception, and they grow in very tough neighborhoods that the analogy to concrete really fits, because these are concrete kingdoms in urban areas that are underfunded and under-resourced, and yet out of even those areas, roses still grow. I think Tupac was trying to say a lot about the differences in America and yet the resilience that is in the human spirit. Well, this is a train map for the city of Washington, D.C. And what you find when you look at a train map of Washington, D.C. is if you look in the bottom right corner, that's the southeast section of D.C., and we will focus on the Capitol Heights section. And if you look in the far outer left corner of Washington, D.C., you go into the Maryland suburbs, where many of the lobbyists and kind of the dignitaries of Washington, D.C. live in much better conditions. What we know is that with each mile you travel, life expectancy increases by about 1.5 years along that train route. In fact, the average suburbanite near the Shady Grove station will live 20 years longer than the typical city dweller around Capitol Heights. This is what we call a health disparity. We saw the definition, but there's no good reason for this. So I do these talks sometimes in front of very conservative groups. I've had people tell me this is because black people are genetically different than white people. I had one guy chase me to my car, actually, and tell me that these shortages in life expectancy and differences are because of black people's lack of understanding of how to be healthy. But these are real disparities, and they're not genetics-based. Human beings are not that different genetically. That's a huge misconception. In fact, the whole construct of race is a fallacy. There aren't multiple races. There's only one race, and it's the human race. And the idea that there are all these multiple races were really used to divide and conquer, just as we know slavery was an amazing tool, not only to subjugate black people, but it was one of the best ways to keep poor white people poor. So all of these things come into play even as we look at life today. Well, when we look at this, and this is my home county now of Los Angeles County, California, and you look at this, the county health department looked at life expectancy trends. And what we found is that if you want to live a long life in Los Angeles, your parents needed to birth an Asian woman. If you're a mother, if your parents didn't make you an Asian woman in Los Angeles County, you started off at a huge disadvantage in terms of life expectancy. And if your parents were so fool as to have a black boy, you're really in trouble. Because only black boys in Los Angeles County don't live on average to be 70 years of age. And of course, nobody gets to choose their parents. And parents don't get to choose the race of their children, for the most part. So what we understand is that these disparities continue to exist no matter how you look at it. And we can pull out to infant mortality, and you see double the rate basically for African Americans. When you look at childhood obesity rates, you see that Latinos and African Americans have much higher rates of childhood obesity, all of which we now know are massively impactful on the long-term quality of life for children. My dissertation I recently did, we focused on this, and we found that it is that early, rapid weight gain in children. And so what you find is that it's that early, rapid weight gain early in life that is blunted and stunted by breastfeeding that actually contributes to later life obesity. And so we know that directly breastfeeding is one of the things that actually impacts this health disparity. And of course, we have the disparity of breastfeeding itself. And so what I want you to get from those last few slides is that there is a correlation between breastfeeding rates and health outcomes, especially for African Americans. that it mirrors and it correlates that we have lower breastfeeding rates and that we have poorer health outcomes. So that's one of the most important things to kind of pick up. And what we now know is that it's not just race. In fact, in America, things are changing. And if you don't get this, you'll miss the boat on where America is going. America is going to have to move at some point beyond being a race-based society. And I want you to get this, because where America is really going is to one in which class is going to determine, and socioeconomics is really going to determine quality of life. And we know this because when you look at the numbers even here, it is income that also impacts breastfeeding rates, regardless of race. And you have to get this because we are moving away from being a developed country to looking more like a developing country. We're beginning to have an exacerbation of the gap between the rich and the poor. And this exacerbation, this massive move of wealth into a very small percentage of Americans and away from the masses is going to make us look more like Jamaica, Haiti, Ecuador, Mexico, Southeast Asia than the other developed countries of the world. And this move is one of the worst things for health. In fact, we looked at studies on counties, and where the income gap is biggest in counties in America, the crime rates proportionally grow up as the income gaps expand. So we are looking at huge and important things for us to address. And we look at age, and we find that if you're younger, you are less likely to breastfeed as well. It's more of a challenge. And with this I'd throw in, if you're a single mother, it is more challenging to breastfeed as well. So you start to look at this, and you put together kind of a hallmark of what are the things that challenge breastfeeding and successful exclusive breastfeeding rates. And what you find is 4 things: being African American, younger mothers, being single, and poverty. So when we look at it, and for a lot of the African American women, they will actually fall into all 4 categories. So we start looking at this and we start to realize that there's a risk that comes with this that means that it's going to be more difficult, more challenging to get women to breastfeed, but it also means that our typical approach to getting women to breastfeed has to be reevaluated. That it can't simply be technique that is taught, as we'll get to in a minute. So one of the things that impacts all 4 of those areas is stress. And there's a definition of stress here. Stress is a condition or feeling experienced when a person perceives that demands exceed the personal and social resources the individual is able to mobilize. So stress is one of the real things. And so we now have a lot of talks around something called allostatic load. And you've probably heard this new term. Allostatic load is this cumulative stress burden that people carry that turns everyday life into an everyday fight or flight situation. And I have an equation that I've produced from that definition that basically says stress equals demands minus resources. You have to get that. Stress equals demands minus resources. And this is impactful because we know that if a woman is stressed, she has less lactogenesis. Right? So if she's under stress, it's actually harder for her to have letdown. So we have to look at what is stressing the women who walk into your institution, that walk into your agency, that come before you. Because if you don't look at that, you make what is already based on the 4 categories I gave you before. Actually, stress then actually becomes the pathophysiological way that the body actually begins to have challenges with breastfeeding. So when some women come in and they're in very difficult situations, they may come out of a situation of domestic violence, poverty, they may have multiple children, all of these challenges, and they walk in and they say, you know what, it just seems like I can't do this. It may not be psychological. It may not simply be cultural. It may honestly be that mother is honestly under such undue stress that the hormones in her body are working against what nature would have her to do. Which means our role goes beyond simply figuring out how to put a baby to latch to figuring out how to get a mother to match. Well, one of the biggest, as I mentioned earlier, stressors is the stressor of racism. And again, I believe that the concept of race was an unfortunate tragedy in human history. The idea that when peoples were discovered in different parts of the world, that they were categorized and placed in different tiers as to who was more human and less human. However, unfortunately, the phenotypical differences, the outward differences between us are what many are still judged upon. And as an African-American male, I can tell you I have experienced this firsthand many, many times, and I didn't live one day in the 60s. So I know that in the United States, even to this day, this is a real challenge. And what we know is that women who report on-the-job racial discrimination had a 32% higher risk of breast cancer than those who did not. Were 48% more likely to develop breast cancer than those who reported no incidents of major discrimination. In fact, the country of Australia has put out posters because of their racist history and of how the Aboriginal people were treated. And their National Public Health Agency actually put out posters that say racism makes me sick, and how the Aboriginal people were treated. And it says it affects my blood pressure and creates anxiety and depression. And the other post, the young lady, it says, it damages my heart, blood pressure, and my unborn baby. So what we know is that we have this impact. Like when, and I always tell a story about running from dogs growing up in Connecticut, jumping fences, trying to get to where I was going so I wouldn't have to walk all the way around the block. We did stuff like that back then. If you landed in the wrong backyard, you landed with a dog that hadn't eaten. And of course, our neighborhood was black and Jamaican. So that dog was mad because he was eating like rice and peas and greens, right? So the dog was upset because the dog wasn't, there's no meat left for that dog usually. So you land in the backyard and like Tom and Jerry, remember that cartoon? You look like a giant piece of steak when you land in that dog's backyard. And all of a sudden that dog goes to attack. But something instantly happens in your body. Adrenaline is released. Cortisol is released. Gluconeogenesis starts in the liver. Your pupils dilate. Blood is shunted away from your digestive tract to the large muscles of your body. Instantaneously, a transformation happens, and you are able to run faster. Your blood pressure goes up. Your heart rate goes up. Blood gets to your brain so you can think straight. All of these things happen in nanoseconds, and you're able to begin to run and move so fast that the poor dog, tethered to the chain, has to watch you jump the fence and take off. Here's the problem for our women and for our men. Too many of them live every day landing in a backyard with a hungry dog. When they go to apply for a job, the person sitting across the counter is that dog. In their relationships, even inside their homes many times, they're in relationships with the cumulative effect of that dog. And so they live when they walk to work and they walk into the mall or they're harassed by the police or they go into substandard housing to live every day. When they go into those situations, they live in a daily chronic fight or flight situation. Which means then that the pathophysiological changes that we now know are true that cause disease are present in them. And that these pathophysiological changes cause disease. That is allostatic load, and we know the markers that you can check to do it. And we know that stress is damaging. But we know that there's an antidote. At least for the mother, the nursing mother, we know that nursing is one of the things that stimulates the parasympathetic nervous system and actually turns down the sympathetic nervous system. So breastfeeding is literally an anti-stress agent. When you take all I'm telling you to heart, and I'll read one of my favorite quotes here in a second. When you take all that I'm saying to heart, when a woman comes into your office of any color, but especially an African-American woman, stressed to the hilt and is having trouble breastfeeding, understand that the stress can be contributing to her challenge, but understand that the breastfeeding can help alleviate her stress. Which means that your role in aiding breastfeeding goes beyond simple technique to life support. Gabriel Palmer, in one of my favorite books, and I'm probably one of the few men in America that has this book in his book collection and actually make sure that everybody sees it, and I tell them that this is a book they should read. I tell everyone they should read this book. If a multinational company developed a product that was nutritionally balanced and delicious food, a wonder drug that both prevented and treated disease and cost almost nothing to produce, the very announcement of their find would send their shares rocketing to the top of the stock market. Women have been producing such a miraculous substance, breast milk, since the beginning of human existence. Here's the challenge. We've become so technologically advanced that we think we must improve on everything nature has done. Because there's profit in improving on nature, even if it's not really an improvement. So we've got to take back tradition, and it was amazing watching the Native American dance theater this morning. But we've got to return to our basic traditional roots, because women all over the world breastfeed. It's not until they come to America, and a lot of times they come here and they think, well, the wealthy women here use formula. And again, it goes back to something mentioned earlier about the dolls and the fact that black girls would pick white dolls and say that they're healthier, better, you know, they're benevolent, and all of the things that we've seen in the studies. It's the same principle. We've got to get people so self-empowered that they simply do what's best for them because it's what's best for them. If 90% of mothers in the United States breastfed their babies for 6 months, the lives of approximately 900 babies would be saved every year. And that was published in the journal Pediatrics. So what is needed? Well, we know that stress equals demands minus resources. And there are a lot of demands on the women we come in contact with. Even the women with good jobs and husbands with good jobs, there are a lot of demands on women, as mentioned earlier. My mother was the mother of 3 boys by herself. We were told multiple times, and my mother was told, in church even, that she was going to raise 3 basically gangsters, 3 criminals. That was the fate of her children. My older brother's an architect, I'm a physician, and my younger brother's a teacher. And let me tell you that one of the things my mother was able to do, despite overwhelming demand, she was able to accumulate resources. She got us mentors, white men, not just black men, white men who take us and take us and play ball with us and take us to the movies and take us out to eat and build our confidence. What we have to bring to these families are resources. We are dealing with people who are having low resources, and breastfeeding alone, like in terms of just technique, isn't the simple resource they need. They need that wraparound support that moves them to a better place. So stress does not equal the demands if you become the resource. The role of our agencies, and many of you are probably at the top of your agencies, but the role of your agencies is to bring this wraparound support to the mothers and families we serve. And somebody talked about fathers earlier. Let me tell you, there's nothing more critical than engaging men in this process. Because I honestly believe that what we know about oxytocin and the bonding that happens between a mother and the child, I want to throw a crazy idea at you. I believe that there's a bonding that happens to the father as he watches and supports that process. So I deal with a concept called collective impact. How could we help you reach your educational goal? You are worthwhile and you have something to contribute to this society. And I try and make it a point to go and speak to all of those groups when we are having our prenatal and our postpartum groups. And I stand before them and tell them the story of my mother and tell them, if we can do it, you can do it. What do you need to help you do it? Education and career advancement, because hopelessness is one of the greatest stressors. Not believing you can never be better is one of the greatest stressors. Family and parenting education and therapy. So how do we give parenting skills? How do we get people in front of therapists? How do we get them into the places where they can get help? How do we give them healthy lifestyle support? We talked about food deserts. We live in a food desert where we are, where our health department is in Pasadena. How do we connect them with good, wholesome food products, and then give them the education and the training and the empowerment to actually live that healthy lifestyle? We talk about financial training. How do we get these mothers to be able to manage their budget and do well with what they have so that they don't have as much worries and stress? And then we do all of the things we need to do around referrals to mental health. My last slide is this one. If I start with Tupac, I feel obligated to finish with Mother Teresa. And Mother Teresa says, we think sometimes that poverty is only being hungry, naked, and homeless. The poverty of being unwanted, unloved, and uncared for is the greatest poverty. My time is up, but let me just say this. Every one of you carries the currency that matters most in America today. You may not be the Gates Foundation and be able to drop big checks on people, but you have the currency of care, the currency of loving, and you can be an amazing philanthropist with that currency. Do not allow adversity, difficulty, and what seems hopeless to stop you from discharging that currency freely every day in your organization and where you work. Thank you.